Welcome, my friends, to this another Johnny Vedmore read through. And today we are going through the second of my Epstein 101 articles, Epstein 101 Coercion and Abuse. This came about due to my research. I was researching the Jeffrey Epstein operations. I had a specific focus on the tours around Africa and Asia that he did with Bill Clinton, the grooming operation, the blackmail operation, the recruitment of girls, the abuse part of the aspects of this enterprise. And it was for One Nation Under Blackmail, mainly volume two. A lot, a lot about the abuse part of this did not go in the book for some reason, and you can't. I don't know why, because I thought they were going to go in the book. So, some of the research that I did, which opened my eyes, those people who have read my Pottinger series know that the operation was nothing like you expect it to be. It was not as it's been advertised to be. The majority of girls weren't being groomed and for abuse by powerful people. They were being groomed for abuse by Jeffrey Epstein himself. It was specifically Jeffrey Epstein's recruitment was the 99.9% of the abuse, because he was having massages 2 to 3 times a day where he was abusing these girls, and he would use a large network headed up by Ghislaine Maxwell, Sarah Kellen, and others, to go out and get these girls, to recruit them off the street, in schools, in leisure centers, be shipped around by people like Virginia Giuffre, who has, of course, I think still has questions to answer about this operation. A lot of it was seen as all of the girls who worked for Epstein were abused. Some of them were actually helping him with the recruitment and the abuse, and have not been held to account at all. And it's a real murky world. You think about this: Epstein's the only one who was going to be prosecuted at the start. Then Ghislaine Maxwell, then Jean-Luc Brunel. 2 out of 3 of those are dead now. So you can see that this is obviously powerful people don't want you to know things. But most of the sexual compromise stuff was a very little bit of Jeffrey Epstein's operation. It's been blown up to be the main part of the operation, but there was Jeffrey Epstein was a high-ranking financier. Most of his work was in running money through different channels for different intelligence operations, mainly by the CIA, and also, of course, working as an interlocutor for the intelligence agencies. So he would bring in Mossad to work with the CIA, etc., Canadian intelligence, French intelligence. Now, the external smuggling routes, some of these girls that were being recruited for Jeffrey Epstein were mainly from America. They were mainly from places like Palm Beach, etc., where he would send out the girls to go recruit them. But some would have to, those if something happened to those girls, there would be a manhunt. If they went missing, if something dastardly, they were found dead, then there would be a massive manhunt. So there was an element where girls were brought in externally as well from overseas. I think one of those routes was Newfoundland, a smuggling route. You would meet Jean-Luc Brunel in France. They would smuggle probably Eastern European girls. I mean, we can see from Marcinko and others that was, that was happening. But smuggled from France, sent to Newfoundland in Canada, where they'd offload them, and then from Canada to America, where you go back and there's no girls on the plane suddenly. The Lolita Express flight logs are extremely telling, but what's probably more telling is what was left off them. There are many people who were left off those flight logs on purpose. And some of those girls will never be found again. That's a fact. So we're going to look through the second of the article. So far, there's 5 parts to the Epstein 101 article. You can find it on newspaste.com. Easy place to go to find most of my work, of course, as most of you know. Let's share my screen with you. Here we are. Look, there's Newspaste. We're on newspaste.com. And it's pretty cool around here. There's lots to see. You can see all the Schwab series of articles. You can see the Epstein 101 series is by here. We're on the second part, Coercion and Abuse. You can already watch the read through for the lure, grooming, and seduction, which goes into parts of the way it works, how grooming, lure, grooming, and seduction work. Here, the Pottinger identity, which is about the supposed Epstein victim lawyer, Stanley Pottinger, who it turns out had loads of connections with Jeffrey Epstein and seems to be managing the girls for the CIA, or the cases for the CIA. Nicole Youngman, she's a Epstein associate, Elon Musk associate, Peter Thiel associate, you name it. She's had me censored all over the place. Black Hand series is going back in time, looking at similar sort of operations and the birth of these operations in the nightclub scene of London. A really interesting group of articles. And of course, there's other articles, including David Shaw and the rise of Jeff Bezos, Pablo Miller, genetics of Bill Gates, welcome fire, blah, 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 blah. There's lots of articles to be had, as you've seen as we go down here, lots of them. I would suggest people read The Father, the Son, and the Mencius Mole Bug, because I think people will start to realize that's an important article eventually. And also Eric R. Weinstein's Great Replacement. Yes, Eric R. Weinstein worked for the United Nations, writing up their migration policy in the early noughties, and now pretends to be the opposite, when in actual fact, he's doing exactly the same thing. If you're wondering what I'm doing, I'm just wiping my glasses down so I can read this properly. I'm going to put on my glasses, and now I'm back to Clark Kent. And here's a cover here. I made up covers especially for the Epstein 101 case. This picture is the living end, honestly, the living end. So here you go. Epstein 101, Coercion and Abuse by Johnny Vedmore via Newspaste Original. I nearly forgot my name then. Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell created a unique sex trafficking operation which had varying facets. Alongside grooming children and young women, the duo also groomed a small gang of pedophile enablers, criminal collaborators, and brainwashed victims to work with them. This collective, regardless of how they originally entered into the enterprise, helped to lure unsuspecting targets into a heavily controlled environment built upon coercion and abuse. Note well, this series has been adapted from notes I made while helping to research with the research for One Nation Under Blackmail Volume 2 by Whitney Webb. And there you go, there's a cover again. Alongside the more willing associates, many of Epstein and Maxwell's accomplices had originally started out as victims of these expert predators. After these unfortunate targets had been brought into the fold, they soon began to be groomed for their specific roles within the enterprise. Many of the people who aligned themselves with Epstein and Maxwell had been through similar grooming process themselves. This included the normalization of behavior which would on any other occasion be seen as unacceptable. The main difference is that adults are expected to understand and recognize such behavior. Ghislaine Maxwell was very much like her father, Robert Maxwell, in the way that she could normalize absurd and grotesque behavior. The Maxwell family had a reputation for creating controversy wherever they went, seemingly on purpose. Ghislaine Maxwell used her various skills and abilities to convince underage girls that their experiences with Jeffrey Epstein were completely normal. She was well known for asserting herself in the position of a friend to make to many of the young girls who were at the same time being traumatized at the hands of her own boyfriend. Maxwell quickly formed bonds with each potential victim, pretending to show interest in their lives while all the time conspiring to see them molested and raped. Named in the 2021 indictment against Ghislaine Maxwell, a 44-year-old lady testified under the pseudonym Kate, also referred to as minor victim free. Her testimony claimed that after her initial recruitment process, Ghislaine Maxwell systematically groomed her. Kate says that she was approximately 18 years old when Epstein and Maxwell invited her to their Palm Beach estate in Florida. She recounts that it had a beautiful swimming pool and that the walls were littered with photographs of naked young girls. They were in almost every room, Kate stated, going on to say of Maxwell, "I was excited to be friends with her. She was exciting. She was everything I wanted to be." Kate told Maxwell all the details about her problems at home, her mother's poor health, and of her want to pursue a career in music. This is how the process of grooming begins, and it is very similar to how one makes friends generally, except in this case, Kate was being groomed to have sex with a rich pederast. Maxwell displayed obvious interest in Kate, telling the teenager about her boyfriend, Jeffrey Epstein, who was a wealthy philanthropist with a passion for helping young people. Kate testified that she was left with a distinct impression that it would be a great for her, for me to meet him, also stating, "She said he was going to love me, and that I was exactly the kind of person he would help." However, as with all grooming techniques, Maxwell's actions would create the perception that she and her target were becoming friends. When Kate entered her guest room in Palm Beach, she was surprised to find that there was a schoolgirl outfit waiting for her on the bed. Kate also testified that she asked Maxwell what the costume was for, and Maxwell responded by handing her a tray and telling her that she thought it would be fun to dress up while Kate was bringing Epstein his tea. Soon after entering the Palm Beach property, Epstein initiated low-level sexual contact with Kate, who recounted, "She asked me if I had fun and told me I was such a good girl and that I was one of his favorites." On one occasion, Maxwell called Kate, saying that Epstein's massage therapist had cancelled and asking if Kate could do her a favor because she had such strong hands. Kate had been complimented, treated kindly, and made to feel special, but once she had formed a significant level of trust towards this new and exciting friend, Maxwell's job was almost done. Kate testified that during this meeting, Epstein was already wearing nothing but a robe, which he soon slipped off. This sudden shock could cause anyone significant alarm, but escape wasn't going to be easy while Maxwell remained standing in the doorway. According to Kate's testimony, Maxwell handed her some massage oils and shut the door. That's when Epstein first initiated sexual contact with his victim. After the event, Maxwell allegedly asked Kate, "How'd it go? Did you have fun? Was it good?" This normalization of abuse in real time is a further part of the grooming process which pedophile predators use against vulnerable victims. On the third occasion, where Kate met Epstein, Maxwell simply told them to have a good time before shutting the door. The hypernormalization of abuse in these situations were often followed closely by a rewarding compliment for the compliance of the victim. After that occasion, Kate recalled Maxwell saying, "You're such a good girl. I'm so happy you were able to come. He obviously likes you a lot." Maxwell was an expert at acting as though very bizarre behavior was completely customary. The aforementioned Kellen also testified that Maxwell entered Epstein's massage room when Caroline was nude. Carolyn states that Maxwell felt her hips, buttocks, and breasts, telling the young girl that she has a great body for Mr. Epstein. Carolyn also went on to reveal that on that occasion, Maxwell groped her breast before leaving the room. Maxwell was diverse and flexible in utilizing many expert grooming techniques to get girls to not only become more compliant, but also drop their personal boundaries. While grooming Kate, Maxwell worked slowly not to spook the young lady too soon. She systematically gave the nervous young girl a reassurance and instilled in her a false sense of confidence, while at the same time Maxwell was crossing Kate's personal boundaries more frequently. Maxwell didn't use this technique with all of the victims. She only saw some of her victims as having future potential, and with these select few, she worked slowly to get them to do whatever she and Epstein desired. Identified as Jane Doe 2, one survivor of Epstein and Maxwell stated, "Things happen slowly over time. It was almost like that analogy of a frog being in a pan of water and slowly turning up the flame." Although Ghislaine Maxwell's involvement was vital to lure and groom these young unsuspecting victims, the clearest examples of grooming and seduction process relating to child sexual abuse were, of course, acts committed mainly by Epstein himself. If you were to extract a repeated theme from the testimony of survivors of Jeffrey Epstein's sexual abuse, you would get a relatively clear picture of the techniques he used to trap these young girls into the cycle of abuse. Witnesses often speak of walking into a room with a robed Jeffrey Epstein who'd quickly expose himself to them. When young girls who have not learnt coping strategies or who lack confidence to assert themselves are suddenly placed in this kind of scenario, they often become obedient and compliant. As previously mentioned, Epstein and Maxwell were relatively fluid and adaptive on how they incorporated their techniques, with some of Epstein's victims describing him as acting in a manner of stereotypical pederast, complimenting and reassuring the victim as he assaulted them in what an offender like Epstein or Maxwell may see as a loving manner. However, other victims describe an emotionless Jeffrey Epstein masturbating on his massage table while he touched their naked bodies. A much smaller portion of his victims describe him as a monster who was fueled by a tangible sense of the fear which emanated from his young and inexperienced prey. Like most psychopaths, all of Epstein's behaviors seem to have been ostensibly driven by a need for power and control over a vulnerable human. But it must also be noted that although a lot of the available evidence points at Epstein being a multi-faced villain who exhibits a range of criminal traits, this is unusual. Criminal profiling has advanced rapidly since its inception, and although there are those who deviate from the standard model, most criminals do exhibit repeated patterns of predictable behavior while offending. Yet it must also be noted that a fraction of the testimony in the case against Epstein describes a pattern of criminal behavior which is unexpected. Although seemingly insignificant in the grander scheme of things, that fraction of testimony doesn't fit with Epstein's normal modus operandi in criminal profiling terms and must eventually be examined more thoroughly. Even though Epstein's actions towards young ladies were mainly to feed his own desires, it also allowed him to test each girl while they were under pressure. In fact, it could be easily argued that the victim's initial experience of being trapped in a room with a sadistic wealthy billionaire was all part of a twisted job interview. Each potential candidate had already been carefully selected by a well-organized and highly focused grooming operation. They then met their prospective employer, and instead of the usual interview questions, the targets was posed with an extremely pressurized situation, which then evoked a range of extreme emotions. This may have been a shocking experience for each of the victims, but for Epstein himself, testing the coping mechanisms of each of these girls was clearly the nub of his reasoning. If one examines each of the victims' testimony concerning their initial experiences of abuse at the hands of Jeffrey Epstein, one may be able to argue that any anomalies in his criminal behavior profile could be due to other reasons. Epstein also dabbled in the art of sex compromise, and he may have been purposely testing his potential recruits to see if they were viable to be involved in much more serious high-level operations. Regardless, it is easy to see who Epstein considered as being vital to their overall operation and, in essence, who had passed or failed his sick test. Shantae Davis gave evidence of her own experience of being raped by Jeffrey Epstein, and her testimony provides a good example of the potential levels to Epstein's sadistic pederast nature. I began my massage, trying not to let him smell my fear and obvious discomfort, but before I knew what was happening, he grabbed onto my wrist and tugged me towards the bed. I tried to pull away, but he was unbuttoning my shorts and pulling my body onto his already naked body faster than I could think. I was searching for words, but all I could say was, "No, please stop." But that just seemed to excite him more. Shantae Davis would spend 2 weeks in hospital after Epstein had raped her. When talking about this period of her life, Davis is quoted as stating that her time was spent vomiting myself to death. One survivor of Epstein was identified as Jane Doe number 9. It gave testimony which helps us to see one of Epstein's main techniques of seduction, where he offered the target a supposed sexual education. She would say of her experience, "When I was 15 years old, I flew on Jeffrey Epstein's plane to Zorro Ranch, where I was sexually molested by him for many hours. What I remember most vividly was him explaining to me how beneficial the experience was for me and how much he was helping me grow." Whether or not Epstein really believed that his molestation of the young girl would really help her grow, these are techniques which are commonly used by male offenders who are sexually attracted to young girls. They are techniques of a child molester. If you calculate the actual data, the scale of Epstein's offending was completely unbelievable. Jeffrey Epstein was systematically assaulting at least 2 to 3 girls a day from the early 90s for a decade or more. If these numbers are true and the operation is as described, Epstein himself committed at least 8,000 sexual offenses over a 10-year period alone. Trying to fathom the sheer scale of his crimes is an almost impossible task, but he couldn't do all of this alone. Although Epstein and Maxwell were the definite apex to this pedophile power pyramid, there were others who facilitated and organized the industrial grooming program which they were running. Some of these were victims of grooming themselves, and others were simply complicit. In this freaky world created by this sick duo of child molesters, girls were being molded to perform certain tasks. Most of Epstein and Maxwell's young victims became fractured psychologically, and this led to an array of complex conclusions. Some girls successfully escaped their sphere of influence, while others kept returning until they were too old to be attractive to Epstein. This appeared to happen once a girl reached about 18 years old. A very carefully curated minority of Epstein's victims were used as tools in the other operations Epstein and Maxwell were organizing. On this sordid conveyor belt of industrial sexual exploitation, many girls became trapped and found themselves in situations which they previously had never thought possible. A majority of the commentators and the members of the general public who have been watching the Epstein case develop are often unable to make a categorical decision between Epstein's victims and distinction between Epstein's victims and his collaborators. In any case where people have been groomed en masse to be sexually exploitative, it is always the initial groomers themselves who are responsible for the bulk of the crimes. However, they often use and train their own victims to become groomers by proxy. This was very much the case with Epstein and Maxwell. Anyone daring to investigate or comment on the Epstein case are left treading carefully. For some of the people who were working for the paedophile billionaire and his sickening partner in crime are also likely to be victims of manipulation themselves. Some others knew exactly what was happening and continued to benefit from the operation regardless. Groomed or groomer. For Jeffrey Epstein to have a long queue of suitable victims who met the very strict age-specific criteria which he demanded, he needed a team of collaborators. These were the people who were organizing the veritable army of underage masseuses and ensuring their compliance by either constant reassurance while being instilled with a false sense of emotional support or by use of threats. The team which organized this systematic abuse of hundreds, if not thousands, of girls was headed up by Maxwell and included a group of people whose task it was to ensure Epstein had a steady flow of children and teenage girls to molest for whenever the mood took him. The people who supported Epstein and Maxwell's criminal endeavors are not necessarily classified in criminal profiling terms as preferential pedophiles like their employers. In fact, most of them probably wouldn't even fit the standard classification of any specific type of pedophile. However, even with that taken into consideration, some people may say that the actions of Epstein and Maxwell's closest collaborators are equal or worse to those of their sick masters. These well-groomed employees of Maxwell and Epstein were busy organizing, preparing, and enacting the regular systematic abuse of children on a daily basis with no apparent care for the damage they were doing to each individual they targeted. Epstein and Maxwell may have been running the show, but without the help of those so-called conspirators, their operations would have probably been impossible to manage and could have seen them become exposed much sooner. One of the key members of this elite group grooming gang was Sarah Kellen, who was employed as Epstein's assistant and has been regularly named in court cases as co-conspirator in Epstein-Maxwell sexual exploitation operation. Kellen was fundamental to the recruitment and grooming of the young girls, as well as clearly being willing to make pseudo-pedophilia images in order to feed the darkest desires of her employer. The West Palm Beach lawyer who represented several accusers in a lawsuit targeting Kellen, Spencer T. Cuvin, said she saw herself as the boss, going on to state Sarah was really running that organization, bringing girls and getting them in and out of the Palm Beach home. It was Kellen's role to greet the unsuspecting victims arriving at the mansion, where she then escorted them into a room with a massage table where Epstein was waiting, often wearing nothing but a towel or a bathrobe. Even though many people are quick to accuse Sarah Kellen of being completely complicit with Epstein and Maxwell's sexual exploitation operation, the truth concerning Sarah Kellen, as with many others who worked within the wider Epstein team, may not be so simple. In fact, Kellen's life leading up to her employment into this evil unit may have already primed her to be easily groomed and abused by Jeffrey Epstein. Sarah Kellen had grown up as a Jehovah's Witness and was reportedly married off by the age of 17 years old. Before she began working for the billionaire pedophile, she had been expelled from the Jehovah's Witnesses and, as with many religiously rigid organizations, shunned by the community she had grown up within. As a newly single former teen bride who had been completely ousted by her community and family, Kellen herself was vulnerable to exploitation. She may not have been a child, but Kellen was very much alone in the world, and she had obviously experienced extremely traumatic events just prior to be given her position as assistant to Jeffrey Epstein. In 2020, Sarah Kellen's parents stated that they had known virtually nothing about their daughter's occupation because they had become estranged from Kellen when she was 18 or 19 years old. In the same article, it was also reported the Jehovah's Witnesses have only seen Kellen, 41, a handful of times and still find it upsetting to see her face in family portraits or hear her name, as well as stating that their daughter was naive and vulnerable when she met the multimillionaire pedophile. Kellen had met her first husband, Noah Bonk, through the church and moved to Hawaii with him to get married. The marriage quickly soured, with rumors of Sarah Kellen being more interested in a glamorous life of modeling and fashion. Kellen was expelled from the church for allegedly leading an immoral lifestyle, which included reported nude modeling. The aforementioned article went on to state that the nude image in question appeared to be a modeling assignment for a life drawing art class rather than pornography. Sarah Kellen's mother, Mary Kellen, told the press that she wasn't mistreated or shunned. She made her own choices. She turned her back on Jehovah God. Her conduct went against the standards. She also stated, it put us in a position where we could not have an association with her unless it was really necessary. I couldn't look at her pictures. I had to put them all away. Even when I heard her name, it was emotionally traumatic for me. But the story of the young Sarah Kellen also has obvious contradictions when one scrutinizes the details further. Sarah Kellen's parents say that she was married at 17 years old and that the marriage only lasted 3 years before Kellen's behavior saw her pulled before the ranks of the Hawaiian chapter of the Jehovah Witnesses and expelled. But Mary Kellen also states that Sarah was quite young, 18 or 19, when she was first recruited into Jeffrey Epstein's operation. Noah Bonk, Kellen's first husband, has remained largely unavailable for comment, but has claimed that Sarah was 18 years old when they married and that the pair had parted on good terms. Kellen was so busy living a jet-setting lifestyle that Noah Bonk was forced to serve her their divorce papers on the tarmac of a runway. Kellen kept in sporadic contact with her parents, and there are clues to her state of mind during this period. It became thematic for Kellen to apologize during these infrequent messages to her parents. She clearly felt guilty for causing them any pain or distress, but she also told them that her employment was causing her concern, stating in one email, reportedly from the year 2000, I just feel so confused. It's hard to express what I feel because half the time I'm not even sure. It does appear that Sarah Kellen may indeed classify herself as a victim of Epstein and Maxwell's professional grooming operation. In a Daily Beast article entitled, Is One of Epstein's Co-Conspirators Suing His Estate? It is reported that the mystery woman is suing for Epstein's cash, saying she's virtually bankrupt from having to defend herself against accusations relating to the pedophile's sex crimes. The mystery woman is identified only as Jane Doe in court documents, but there are many clues to the claimant actually being Sarah Kellen. And there she is. Sarah Kellen attends the Kentucky Derby alongside Brian Vickers in 2015. The complaint, which was filed by the law firm Kaiser, Starborn and Mayer, a firm which also represents another Epstein survivor, Jennifer Aroz, stated that their client seeks justice for the sexual crimes perpetrated against her by Jeffrey Epstein over the course of many years and for the abuse, manipulation, and exploitation she suffered at his hands. It also states that this lawsuit is about Jane Doe claiming her power, becoming a survivor, not a victim, and getting restitution for the sexual crimes perpetrated against her. The filing of the complaint was met with strongly worded response from the lawyers of multiple Epstein survivors, Boris Schiller Flexner LLP, Sigrid McCauley, who represents the law firm, said that the act of a potential co-conspirator filing for damages against Epstein estates is a shameless act and a disgraceful insult to the real victims. They have to be careful saying that because clearly some of the people they represent can also be classed as co-conspirators. But the court filings also revealed some of what the accusers claimed happened to her at the hands of Jeffrey Epstein, with the complaint stating, Epstein frequently directed Jane Doe to turn her head back during their sexual encounters, telling her that he didn't want to see her face. Wow. Kellen married a NASCAR driver in 2013, changing her last name to Vickers. Whether or not Sarah Kellen sees herself as a victim, in reality, she was vital to every part of Epstein and Maxwell's operation. She didn't only conspire to commit illegal acts for money, she was profiteering from the abuse of exploited young girls and was busy luring them into Epstein's massage room, grooming them, arranging them for them to be raped, and then managing any potential consequences. Yet, in this twisted world of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, even Sarah Kellen could still be classed as a victim. Alongside Sarah Kellen, helping to organize and facilitate Epstein's sexual abuse, were a carefully selected team which include Polish-born Adriana Ross. She was a former Playboy model who allegedly helped organize Epstein's abuse. Ross had moved to Florida in 2002, where she was soon hired to work at Epstein's estate. Ross also called herself Adriana Mukinska and was a frequent flyer aboard the infamous Lolita Express, with flight records showing that Ross accompanied US President Bill Clinton on the well-renowned party plane. Ross was questioned in 2010 civil suit targeted at Prince Andrew's participation within the pedophile sex ring. Ross had repeatedly refused to comment, invoking her Fifth Amendment rights whilst under questioning. One of the more senior members of the Epstein and Maxwell grooming gang was Leslie Groff, who was officially Epstein's executive assistant. Groff coordinated travel and transportation of Epstein and his entourage, including underage girls who were being trafficked specifically for sex. In a 2017 lawsuit, it alleged that she was also responsible for arranging the massage itineraries of Epstein's many victims. Groff is also said to have taken steps to ensure the girls complied with the rules of behavior imposed by them on them by the enterprise. Leslie Groff was treated well by Epstein and was seen by him as being a vital member of the organization. In 2004, she announced that she was pregnant and that she had intended to leave the group. Epstein wooed her by buying her a Mercedes and offered to pay for a full-time nanny. He told reporters at the time, "There is no way that I could lose Leslie to motherhood." Groff is understood to have been being paid a salary at the time of around $200,000. With the help of this small team, Epstein and Maxwell were able to effectively manipulate and control hundreds of girls throughout the bulk of their offending. These were some of the main conspirators for what was an illegal enterprise which trafficked young, vulnerable girls across national and continental borders. They were not the only people creating an essence of normality within this lurid operation designed by Epstein and Maxwell. Many of Epstein and Maxwell's friendship group was made up of some rather cliched characters from high-born families, and they were also utilized in different ways by sex-offending duo. Their rich and powerful allies gave Epstein and Maxwell further credibility and provided their group an extra level of protection from official scrutiny. But this high-level access also provided them with potential targets and marks for future compromise operations. All of the people who regularly swam in Epstein's shark-infested waters were exposed to illegal activity on a daily basis. It would be impossible for anyone who spent a significant amount of time with Epstein and Maxwell to ignore the illicit behavior and the blatant sexual abuse and trafficking of exploited children. But all of Epstein and Maxwell's close associates were mainly clinging on to the pair for their own financial benefit, and in return, many of them clearly became morally and ethically flexible. These people may have been groomed in various ways, but they were definitely lured and seduced by two of the oldest enticements in the book: power and wealth. As we all know, Epstein and Maxwell had formed this freaky world of organized pedophilia for more than just their own sick desires. Once they had a close team of collaborators willing to do whatever they demanded, as well as a group of young girls who they had groomed as veritable sex slaves, Maxwell and Epstein began their sophisticated sexual compromise and general influence operations. They had assembled one of the most professional and focused grooming gangs in recorded history, and, as previously mentioned, it wasn't only young girls that this dastardly pair were targeting for grooming. But like with any outlandish plan designed and implemented by intelligence-linked psychopaths, not everything went to plan. Those left behind. For many years, hundreds of survivors who had suffered abuse at the hands of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell were completely ignored. Their experiences were covered up, denied, and belittled before they finally began to taste some form of justice. When Jeffrey Epstein was found strangled to death in his prison cell, much of the testimony and mountains of evidence against him remained left unheard. To placate the loss of justice, the judiciary agreed to hear testimony from some of the survivors. These were only a handful of voices, survivors of one of the most prolific and well-protected sex offenders in modern time. I have already quoted some of the testimony from the individuals affected, but what I haven't explained to you in this article is that what happened to the groomed girls afterwards. Specifically, what had happened once they had left the sphere of influence of Maxwell and Epstein's sickening operation. At the aforementioned hearing, Anushka Georgia said of her experience, "Something I think is very important to communicate is that loss of innocence, trust, and joy that is not recoverable. The abuse spanning several years was devaluing beyond measure and affected my ability to form and maintain healthy relationships, both in my work and my personal life. He could not begin to fathom what he took from us." This example of Anushka's struggle was echoed by others who spoke, with the survivor referred to as Jane Doe number 3 stating, "My world kind of spiraled after that. I stopped going on modeling castings. I gained weight. I became depressed. I stopped going out with my friends. And only 5 months after I had been in New York City to pursue my dream, I left. I left the modeling industry. I left New York City and totally switched my career path." These sentiments were also the essence of what Jane Doe number 4 stated. "We will always carry irreparable damage and pain throughout our lives after this. It's something that's never going to go away. Whoever we marry in our life, whatever future we have in our life, it's always going to be something that's always there for us." Many of Epstein's victims were lured into a world which still remains unimaginable for most outside observers today. The lavish lifestyles of these wealthy players made it easy to attract the sheep directly into the wolf's lair. Many of the targets of this illicit ruse were very young schoolgirls who were bedazzled by a carefully crafted illusion which these sex offenders created with their extreme wealth and power. These girls nervously stepped across the threshold of Epstein's many properties only to find themselves stripped of more than just their clothes. Each girl experienced a systematic stripping of their dignity through the molestation and abuse by their emotionless assailant. Jennifer Areos spoke of her personal journey. "He robbed me of my dreams. He robbed me of my chance to pursue a career I always adored. He stole my chance at really feeling love because I was so scared to trust anyone for so many years that I had such severe anxiety. I didn't want to leave my house, let alone my bed." It should also be considered that some survivors of sexual abuse don't make it to old age, a fate which almost met Jane Doe number 10, who told of her darkest moments. "Epstein targeted and took advantage of me, a young girl whose mother had recently died in her horrific death and whose family structure had deteriorated. His actions placed me, a young girl, into a downward spiral to the point where I purchased a gun and drove myself to an isolated place to end my suffering." The survivor, referred to as Jane Doe 6, stated, "Epstein stole my innocence. He gave me a life sentence of guilt and shame. I do not consider myself a victim. I see myself as a survivor." There were hundreds of victims who experienced hardship and pain after their own experience of sexual abuse, and only a few were able or willing enough to speak out loud about their stories. But there are a few people whose names will always resonate strongly with anyone who follows the Epstein case closely enough. One of the most vocal and seemingly determined survivors of Epstein is Virginia Roberts Giuffre, who could easily be described as the face of the Epstein survivors. Virginia didn't sound like a victim when she spoke after Epstein's death. She sounded defiant. She reminded all who had ears to hear that he, Epstein, will not have his day in court, but the reckoning of accountability has begun. supported by the voices of these brave and beautiful women in this courtroom today. The reckoning must not end. It must continue. He must not act alone, and we, the victims, know that. The systematic grooming of young girls on an industrial scale for the sake of Epstein's personal perversion wreaked devastation among the people who were his targets. Grooming and sexual exploitation has an effect not only on the lives of individual survivors, but also on the lives of the close friends and family of the victims, as well as all of the other future relationships. This damage is still reverberating throughout the lives of every single one of Epstein and Maxwell's victims. In the eyes of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, these people were seen as little more as disposable, soulless objects and were treated as such. Epstein and Maxwell were compulsive narcissists who were able to see the damage they were doing to their young victims and who fed off the discomfort and pain of their captives. This was very much to the benefit of their wider intelligence operation, because these elite pedophiles weren't only grooming their targets to feed their own sick desires, they were also psychologically breaking these vulnerable girls one by one in an effort to find those with potential. Those who met the required criteria would go on to be used in high-level sexual compromise and influence operations. This method worked very well in meeting the short-term sexual needs of Epstein and Maxwell, but it also allowed for them to test each girl under extreme pressure and for them to find those whose coping mechanisms suited the required characteristics needed to become a useful controlled asset. This was a complex psychological operation which was designed to break people mentally and then use trauma to form the desired behaviors required of the chosen recruits. These young girls weren't only groomed for sexual exploitation in many ways, they were psychologically reprogrammed to respond positively to abusive situations and scenarios. One of the most significant issues to note about this affair is that the fact that many of Epstein's targets had been previous victims of abuse and so were already primed to respond in a predictable way to further abusive advances under certain situations. This included switching off or shutting down parts of their emotional input and output as a survival mechanism. Yet people who suffer sexual abuse can only suppress the effects of their experiences for so long before their psyches fracture. For many survivors of sexual exploitation, that psychological debt only catches up with them many years after they suffer their initial experience of abuse. For a decade or so, Epstein's grooming enterprise was one of the most complicated and sophisticated sexual compromise and influence operations in history, targeting people with significant power. Once the grooming of enough girls for sexual exploitation had been completed, Epstein and Maxwell had the fuel they required for their proverbial fire. Using the lure of sexually exploited teenage girls, Epstein and Maxwell could get on with their main goal. They were planning to groom, compromise, and influence some of the most powerful people on the world stage. And they did just that. In the third part of the Epstein 101 series, we'll learn about the history of blackmail and sexual compromise, and we'll also begin to examine how Epstein wielded his influence. Indeed, we will. Underneath here, as you see, are the sources. They're labeled down. I normally include lots of the sources. This is mainly because they were written down like this for the book. So Kate Bricolet, me and her have had a couple of. She's down a couple of them. Daily Beast articles. She had to note a picture I found that was used to advertise One Nation Under Blackmail was from the Singapore archives. They had someone else, they had noted someone else down as being the one to find out. So me and her had a bit of a backwards and forwards. You can read my most recent Epstein piece as I read this, Musk and Epstein, the Third Culture Dossier, how Elon Musk was trained in psychological manipulation via Jeffrey Epstein funded program. You can read that here on News Paste as well. You can also read Eric Weinstein's Great Replacement, where I reveal about Eric R. Weinstein's work for the United Nations, which maps out the unfettered economic migration we're seeing unfold today. Whoo, and you can support the work, of course. And I need your help. I don't get paid by anyone, so life is hard always. So you could buy me a coffee, you could become a Patreon, or you can support me on Ko-Fi. Buy me a coffee is pretty easy. Patreon, you'll get things early, of course, and I thank my Patreon members. They've been wonderful, help me out no end. And there you go. That is the second of the Epstein 101 articles. It's hard to get through. It's emotional in itself. I mean, there's a couple of times there, I'm not sure if you would have heard, but my voice was breaking because, like, I'm a very empathic type of character. So when dealing with these cases, I get very attached to the victim statements and to the victims' lives. And I feel for them. Same happened in Black Hand series. I mean, I wouldn't have written the Black Hand series if it wasn't for the fact that I was emotionally attached to one woman in particular, just from reading bits of her story, and then it was just like driven on by wanting to tell a story, tell a story for the people who ain't going to be able to tell the stories themselves. I got I'm a writer. That's what I do. I investigate these sort of things. I investigate crimes. And some of these crimes are devastating, they're awful. They remind me of my own experience. I mean, for those who know me, I was groomed when I was between the age of 9 and 11 by a pedophile. And I was very lucky. I was very lucky that, in a sense, I was lucky that I was wise about sex by that point. I know I was pretty young, but I mean, I used to stay up late and watch all the naughty movies, and I used to wake up early and when we rented out a movie I wasn't allowed to watch, I'd run downstairs and I'd watch it before my family got up. So I was, I'd been exposed to loads early on, and in a sense that helped me in my own situation because it made me realize that what was happening wasn't normal, but still, I hid it from my parents and I endured it because I was scared I'd get in trouble, like any kid is. And I know how much it affected my life negatively. I know people who have been groomed, and I know people who have gone through this sort of experience before, and the same psychological traits come afterwards. You suffer the same form of pain, the same fracture, the same inability to understand why the concept of the sexualization as a child is too hard for you to fathom most of the time. So this is a bit of an emotional one. This is a bit of an emotional one. It's sad. If you notice on this, in this article, I try and like walk a line that's it's a very thin line. It's a line between seeing the people who are committing actions that will see other girls groomed and abused, trying to still see those guys as victims or not. Because a load of the people who claimed that Epstein groomed and abused them helped groom and abuse other girls. So they were part of the cycle. Then the reason why people like that in those situations don't get tried in court and why they don't take cases against them, because it'd be really hard to take those cases and try them by law. So they don't, because they're probably not going to get convictions. It doesn't mean that they don't hold some form of culpability. And, since writing this and since that time, I have become a lot wiser about some of the victims in the Jeffrey Epstein. Some of them barefaced liars. Some of them, and this is partly why it was useful to like study the legal side, the psychological side, the behavioral side, the understanding why people do things and what profiles these people, what criminal profiles these people have. Because once you understand criminal profiling, you understand that if you look at an offender like Jeffrey Epstein and you see their behavior over time, over and over again, it's repeated behavior. And the bits that stand out the most are the bits that aren't repeated, the bits that don't make sense, the bits where suddenly he's supposedly abusing a woman in mid-20s just did not happen. Just Epstein was a preferential pedophile. He was just into young girls. He wasn't interested in abusing. So there's some stories which then when you investigate them, you discover that people have been lying to make money. And they've done it. They've made money. They've been paid out in these cases, but from lies. Some of them worked with intelligence linked people to control these cases. And it was one of the most controlled cases because Epstein worked for intelligence and intelligence had to cover up a load of what he did. So the majority of people who were talking about this case were often linked with intelligence as well. So it's a messy, murky world. What would you expect? Epstein and Maxwell, but a messy and murky world. And there's always going to be more to come. There's always going to be more to come. People don't realize that these cases, they don't just end once we've discovered them. You discover more and more, and you realize that Epstein, the least of his crimes were these crimes. The majority of his crimes were financial crimes, were working for the government, were working for intelligence, were working for manipulators, movers, shakers, elites, in moving their money around. Everyone from Noam Chomsky to bloody Stephen Hawkins, everybody, they're unapologetic about it. Noam Chomsky himself, unapologetic about it, which I think kind of like shows you that you don't want to trust the people you're told you're supposed to trust. Oh, look, this establishment member you're allowed to trust, and this one you're not allowed to trust. Don't listen to those guys over there who are saying everything. Just listen to the ones that we want you to listen to. And that comes up over and over again. And it's complicated. But there's 3 more read-throughs to do on these, so they'll be done soon. And I hope you enjoyed, and there'll be plenty more to come. I've got loads of ideas for this year that's coming. Hopefully, I'll be able to get a few of them done. It's been pretty wild, too. 2024 was pretty wild. Not as wild as 2023. That was a devastating year. Hopefully, I'll be able to get more done this year. So thank you for all your support. Thank you for supporting me. And that was another Johnny Vedmore read-through. Bye!
Young generation, like Prime Minister Trudeau, President of Argentina and so on, that we penetrate the cabinets.